welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldi, your host. Uh, as you all know, we are operating this in a hybrid format. So we do have those in attendance here, those on Zoom. When we take questions from the audience, we'll be using a mic and passing it around. Um, Let me note that if you're not on the seminar list, email list, and you want to be, send me an email at Joseph_Aldi at hks.harvard.edu, and we'll add you to the email list. As I mentioned last week, we have a number of talks this semester on the Inflation Reduction Act. Not because we care about inflation in this seminar series, but inflation is important, but because of all the many policies and programs in the Inflation Reduction Act addressing energy and climate change. And so I'm excited that we have with us today Karl Hausker to share his insights on the law. Dr. Hausker is a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute Climate Program. He leads analysis and modeling of deep decarbonization, climate mitigation, electricity market design, and the social cost of carbon. He's worked for 3 decades in the fields of climate change, energy, and environment in a career that has spanned legislative and executive branches, research institutions, NGOs, and consulting. He's led climate policy analysis and modeling projects for USAID, EPA, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the Western Climate Initiative, and the California Air Resources Board. Previously, he served as the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Policy at EPA, Chief Economist to the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, and as a Vice President at ICF International. Karl, welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Thank you so much, Joe. Appreciate the chance to be here with you. And if indeed the Inflation Reduction Act is successful, maybe we will rename it the Temperature Reduction Act, but we're going to have to let a few years elapse first. Let me run by what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'm going to give some contextual stuff, a brief history of U.S. climate policy in one slide. And then I'm going to review the 4 key strategies we need to do to achieve net zero CO2 emissions. And then that'll set me up for a brief overview of the IRA climate provisions. We'll take a quick break for some Q&A after that before doing a deep dive on what I think are 2 key issues embedded in this bill. One is, how do we do electricity decarbonization? Asking the question, why not 100% renewable electricity? Second deep dive will be on carbon capture in its various forms. Carbon capture and utilization, carbon capture and storage, carbon dioxide removal. And posing the question, is it a solution, or as some might say, this is a problem? My final conclusion is going to be, we really need to spread our chips at the casino of mitigating climate change over many technologies, many approaches, because some are going to succeed and some are going to fail. And we'll wrap up with at least an introduction to thinking about some of the implementation issues surrounding the IRA. I'm going to move fairly fast through this material, but you'll all get a copy of the PowerPoint, which will have the links that I point to here. If you want to do a deeper dive on any of these issues, I'm going to provide those for you. So let's get going with a brief history of the major U.S. climate policy, or attempts at climate policy, which have largely focused on policy sticks, not carrots. In 1993, the Clinton administration attempted to pass a BTU tax broadly across many energy sources. And they said it was about pollution, it was about climate, it was about energy security. It actually managed to pass the House, and it died in the Senate. And several members of Congress lost their seats in the next election. 1997, many of you know, of course, that was the year that nations negotiated the Kyoto Protocol. The US was a leader in that negotiations, and the Kyoto Protocol envisioned an international emissions trading system. And when Al Gore and others brought that back to the US, it was never offered to the Senate for ratification. There was simply not the political support in the US to move forward with a US trading system coupled with an international trading system. 2009, the next major attempt to do a comprehensive climate policy for the US. There was the Waxman-Markey cap and trade legislation across all greenhouse gases, across the entire economy. It passed the House. It died in the Senate. And several members of Congress lost their seats in part because of that vote. Are we seeing the pattern here? Finally, fast forward 13 more years, and we now have a national climate policy, Inflation Reduction Act. And instead of the sticks of taxes or cap and trade, it is about 99% carrots, incentives in tax provisions, loan, federal procurement, grants, probably totaling up around $369 billion over 10 years, although that's a projection. It's not a hard and fast number because we're not sure who's going to take advantage of which tax credits and what volume. A very interesting thing you need to keep in mind too is that this act is coupled with an act that passed in November 2021, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, that was passed on a bipartisan basis. Also, just before this bill passed, there was the CHIPS and Science Act. And together, these three bills form a very comprehensive research, development, demonstration, and deployment program that, if successful, could really put the U.S. on a good path to the clean energy transition that we need. Now, I don't want to oversimplify. There are existing stick policies in place that are worth noting, and the U.S. has been making some pretty good progress in recent years as our total greenhouse gas emissions have been on a downward slope since 2005. What have been some of the major pieces of those sticks? Appliance efficiency standards in place for years, long history, and thankfully rarely weakened as power shifts between parties in the U.S. We've also had CAFE standards for decades, and more recently, GHG emission standards. Unfortunately, these have suffered a lot of flip-flops, most pronounced between Obama and then Trump and now Biden administrations. Similarly with power plant standards for CO2, Obama first put them in place, Trump repealed them, now Biden's trying to get them back in place. But even though these have flip-flopped, I think they have sent a series of signals to the relevant industries that you're going to have to move toward cleaner technology and fewer emissions. It's also very important to note that the U.S. just earlier this month, in fact, days ago, ratified the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. This is part of an ongoing effort to reduce the CFCs, HFCs that not only heal the ozone layer, but then have a beneficial effect in terms of global warming. So again, that's a major success recently, and I believe we had the support of 69 senators ratifying that. There's also very important things happening at the U.S., of course, at the subnational level. Two cap and trade systems. California, very large economy, has a cap and trade system covering 80% of its GHG emissions. And here in Massachusetts, your state is part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which has capped CO2 from the power sector from 12 Northeast states. Also, very notably, we've had state renewable portfolio standards, which is a form of sticks. And that combined with the federal production tax credits and investment tax credits for renewables have really helped decarbonize the power sector, along with, of course, abundant natural gas. So, you know, this is a mixed bag. It's been very tough to get a comprehensive national policy in place. We now have one, and that can build on some of the success of these other stick policies that have been having some beneficial effects over the years. So now I want to talk about the 4 key strategies to get to a net zero CO2 economy, and we'll see how the IRA maps to that. I like these 4 strategies are really consistent across a whole body of net zero pathway modeling by whether it's the IPCC or the International Energy Agency or IRENA or various other studies like the Princeton Net Zero America study. This particular graph happens to be from a study by Jim Williams and colleagues out in California. And the 4 key strategies, I always like to start with this one, energy efficiency. To get to net zero, we need to make all of our end uses as efficient as possible. And we know that we can take like the gigajoules per person now, currently about 200 gigajoules per person per year. We can reduce that by 1/3 or more over the next 30 years by applying technologies and practices that are commercial and acceptable. Once we make the economy as efficient as possible, the second strategy is to electrify as many end uses as possible across the economy, substituting the direct use of electricity for the burning of fossil fuels. And of course, we can do that in our buildings with space heating, water heating. We can do that in transportation with a movement to electric vehicles. And we can do that in several industrial applications where we can electrify our heat source instead of burning fossil fuels. Where we can't do that, we can use electricity to make fuels like hydrogen, ammonia, or synthetic fuels to, again, switch away from fossil fuels. Once we do that, electricity demand is going to grow like crazy. And of course, then we have to then do the third strategy, which is take our emissions from the electric sector down to zero. Right now, the U.S. has about 500 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. We have multiple technologies that can take that down to near zero by 2050. The fourth pillar, of course, is capturing carbon from industrial sources where we haven't been able to switch it to electricity or hydrogen, capturing CO2 from power plants and sequestering it, or also taking CO2 directly out of the air to reduce the warming. And we'll come back to that in a moment. I'm focusing on CO2 here. Of course, don't forget the non-CO2 gases, methane, nitrous oxide, and the F gases. So how does the IRA map to these four strategies? The IRA is sprawling. I can only touch on it here and highlight a few things to illustrate. In the area of energy efficiency, it has tax credits for various home improvements, windows, doors, heat pumps, electric stoves, as provisions to make investments in low carbon materials and buildings and advance energy efficiency in the industrial sector as well. Second strategy, electrification of end uses, lots of clean vehicle tax credits for both private purchases and commercial purchases, has grants for clean heavy duty vehicles and especially school buses. We have a major program underway at WRI that will now be assisted by the grants here for electric school buses. We have a clean hydrogen production tax credit that's scaled by how GHG intensive it is. But if we're fortunate, we will really kickstart the hydrogen production industry. And finally, we have other fuel production tax credits that will spur lower carbon aviation fuels and additional biofuels. The third pillar and how these provisions map to that is electricity decarbonization. Beginning in 2025, there will be a new set of tax credits, both for either production or investment, that are applicable to all zero carbon electricity sources. So we'll move away from a focus on just renewables to anything that industry can come up with to produce electricity with zero carbon emissions. That will broaden this kind of support to new nuclear plants, but also the IRA creates a production tax credit for existing nuclear plants. As many of you know, these have been under a lot of pressure from low wholesale electric prices, and some states have given extra support to keep these zero carbon source online. We now have a federal support for that. Other aspects of the bill promote offshore wind via leasing of federal lands. There's grants to facilitate new transmission lines, because we're going to need a much bigger transmission network in the US to accomplish this. In the fourth category of carbon capture, we have enhanced carbon capture and sequestration tax credits, including for the technological removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. We have investments in biomass, various natural carbon removal steps, particularly in the management of forests under the category of natural carbon dioxide removal, and all sorts of funding for agriculture and forestry programs that will keep more carbon in the soil and in trees. But there's really so much more to the IRA than just supporting these four pillars. We do have a stick in there. That's the 1% of the IRA that's a stick. It's a fee on methane emissions from facilities with excess of 25K tons of CO2 equivalent. We also have very interesting cross-cutting provisions. First of all, just on something called direct pay and transferability, where more entities can take advantage of tax credits, even if they don't have tax liability. That expands, to nonprofits and expands also the businesses that can take advantage of these. The tax credits for renewable energy, for zero carbon energy, often start low but have bonuses if those projects are located in either energy communities that are where the economy base is shrinking as fossil fuels shrink, or in low income communities. There are bonuses for projects that meet prevailing wage levels, have apprenticeship programs, and meet certain domestic content requirements. There's also a bunch of advanced manufacturing production tax credits that are intended to spur US manufacturing. We also have a huge slug of money for environmental justice grants to try to help those communities that have traditionally borne the brunt of excess pollution levels. So when you take all these together, trying to solving the 4 pillars of the climate problem, and also these provisions aimed at job creation and equity, you have a pretty amazing package that should enhance jobs, the economy, wages, and address some of the equity issues in the US economy. I have a link here to a WRI modeling study that was just released. That's not exactly on the IRA provisions, but many provisions that are very similar to it that try to tease out what some of those jobs impacts might be. For a comprehensive summary of the whole IRA, I have a link here to a study or a paper by the Bipartisan Policy Center, which I think is the most comprehensive and objective description of what's going on here. And also that synergy of the IRA, the IIJA, and the CHIPS bill, very good paper by an organization called Third Way that shows how those fit together to a comprehensive RD&D policy. What will this do to US emissions? Really happy to see 3 great groups, perhaps even 4 groups that that had models sort of primed to go to analyze the impacts of this. And I display the results of one study here, but the groups are the Rhodium Group, Energy Innovations, Resources of the Future, and also I think I left off my friend and colleague Jesse Jenkins at Princeton, who also ran numbers on this. There's a really nice RFF webinar that they put together that shows all 3 modeling studies and has the slides posted from that. But in broad terms, these studies all came with relatively similar results. What you see here is the million metric tons of all greenhouse gases, CO2 equivalent. Back in 2005, we were up over 6,500 million tons. With those existing sticks and carrots, we have been on a downward trajectory. That's good. But ultimately, the US made a commitment at the Paris COP to get to around 50% reductions below 2005 levels by 2030. So our current policies were taking us in the range of 30% by then. The IRA, most of these studies think we can get in the zone of about a 40% reduction. So we still have some work ahead of us to do to get down to 50%. But this was a huge step forward given where we were in summer, where we thought maybe we're going to have no climate policy at all. And again, I have links here to these studies in that webinar. So let me just stop there for a second. Let's take a few questions before I do my deep dives. Yes, we'll get a microphone to you, and hope the folks on Zoom can hear with no problems.
Thank you, sir, so much for the presentation. Would you mind going back to the slide where you were showing the comparison of graphs in the reduction, like the 4, yes, this one. So I noticed that under electricity decarbonization, you have quite an ambitious target over there. And from my understanding, current sources of renewable energy, such as wind and solar, the biggest problem they face, well, there's number 1, intermittency. Number 2, there's the storage problem, which is closely related to our capacity to store them. So do you foresee the reemergence of nuclear energy, whether it's nuclear fusion or nuclear fission, to sort of supplant this gap, to produce energy sufficiently and reliable? Because solar and wind, clearly they're not working right now.
That is the topic of deep dive number 1, which I'll turn to next. The short answer is yes, that I think we will need more than just renewables to get us to zero emissions in an affordable way and to maintain a reliable grid. But like I say, we'll do a deep dive. Okay, we have, let's take 2 more questions.
Hi, I was wondering, are the sources of uncertainty across the 3 energy systems models, and where the reductions are going to come from, are they similar? Like, are they saying that, when we have the current policy at, or excuse me, the ambitious policy has a range, is it due to the same factors that are going to change in 2030?
Across the modeling, I would guess yes. You may have seen that this description of the uncertainty range. Fossil fuel prices, the lower they go, the harder it is to reduce emissions. The stronger economic growth, you're going to have higher emissions. And so this modeling is from the Rhodian group, and they spelled that out. I think the uncertainty bars in the other modeling would certainly also reflect what are fossil fuel prices doing, how strong is economic growth. But there's also lots of other factors, like I said, if no one uses the tax credits, we're not going to get emissions reductions. In comparison to the stronger certainty of a cap and trade system, where you probably have a really good idea where it's going to come out, but the costs of achieving that would be much more uncertain. One more question, then we'll move on.
Thanks so much. What's the one measure you would have liked to have seen that could have been in the IRA that didn't make it? Or what's the measure in there that you would have amped up that would have given us the best bang for buck in emissions reductions?
What is the one thing that's missing? Well, I won't give my personal preference, but I think it's fun to note that for 30 years, economists and policy wonks have said carbon tax is the answer. If we get that right, we'll solve this problem. Or a cap and trade system is the answer if we set that at the right level and have the right design. And the U.S. political system was simply incapable of doing either of those approaches. And instead, like I say, we have a torrent of carrots, and now we're going to have to pull together and make this work. So let's do a deep dive on the question that was posed a minute ago. I'm going to speak broadly and say that in the 2 pillars of increasing energy efficiency and electrification of end uses, there's not much debate or controversy among climate hawks on these. Everybody sort of agrees. Let's push those to the maximum. But then when you get to the pillar of electricity decarbonization, there is debate over what role should there be for nuclear? Should carbon capture be deployed on electricity generating plants? And then when we move to the 4th strategy, there is also debate and controversy over the use of carbon capture, again, broadly, power sector, industry, or using technology to literally pull CO2 out of the air and inject it underground. So let's turn to how do we decarbonize electricity generation? As I'm sure many of you know, there are strong advocates for doing this with 100% renewables. There are NGOs devoted to this. There are business groups devoted to buying 100% renewable energy. There are mayors devoted to this. And even Budweiser will try to sell you a can of beer brewed with 100% renewable energy. So clearly this has a lot of interest and support out there. And there are reasons to be bullish about renewables. As you probably know, the costs of solar and wind have dropped dramatically, and that is great news. And that is why this is going to feel less like a hair shirt than it did 10 years ago. These are projections from the latest IPCC report, Work Group 3, part of the 6th assessment report, that shows what, for many of you are probably familiar, cost trends over 20 years, with the cost of PV dropping dramatically, onshore wind, offshore wind, concentrating solar power. Just in the last decade, solar PV has been down about 85%, and onshore wind down about 55%. And as the IPCC even says, and as many others say, we're getting into competitive zones with fossil fuel generation, as indicated by the gray zones on the figure. One pet peeve I just want to flag everybody on is this is really electricity. This is not energy. Energy comes in many forms: electricity, solid fuels, gaseous fuels, liquid fuels. Let's make sure we keep in mind that this is electricity, which we can do a lot with, but it's not energy in all its forms. You've probably also seen sort of breathless headlines across trade press and newspapers that renewables have won the battle against fossil fuels. Solar and wind costs are so low, they're cheaper than even existing coal and nuclear plants, just the operating cost of these plants. Solar plants are going to be cheaper than natural gas just about everywhere by next year. What is behind these assertions on cost, and why wouldn't we just choose the cheapest energy thing? The key thing, one of the big takeaways, if you haven't already plunged into the power system, is to know that all of these assertions are made on the basis of something called LCOE, the levelized cost of energy, really the levelized cost of electricity, but everybody calls it energy. So what is LCOE? Why is this metric so important? And if solar and wind are so cheap now, undercutting everything, why did the IRA take a technology neutral approach beginning in 2025 to support all forms of zero carbon energy? These existing renewable tax credits sunset in 2024. We go to technology neutral approach. And as I said earlier, we also have this production tax credit for nuclear plants that are already operating. And there's something called the 45Q tax credit, which could be used to lower the cost of, say, fossil fuel plants with CCS. But if renewables are cheapest, why aren't we just heading toward 100% renewable grids? Well, my favorite sport is basketball. You might be able to guess why. I like to make basketball analogies. So if your top scorer is your shooting guard, averaging over 30 points a game, why not just hire 4 more shooting guards? And that's your team, right? There's a reason. What we need to do in building power systems is not focus on LCOE, but focus on system costs. The LCOE is the average cost of a megawatt hour from a standalone plant, disembodied from any grid and disembodied from the production pattern coming out of that plant or its dispatchability. This is kind of the equivalent of just focusing on your shooting guard, like how many points is Steph Curry scoring these days? What we want to do is focus on system cost, which is the average cost of an entire power system, including all plants and technologies that are needed to maintain a reliable grid, which is equivalent to looking at your whole team and the composition of what makes a winning team and not just who's scoring the most points. And I want to assert to you that all credible modeling of power systems maintains that as a power system approaches 100% wind and solar, the system cost will increase sharply in a nonlinear way, and reliability will be harder to maintain. This is widely accepted in the literature put forth by the IPCC, IEA, IRENA, the Energy Transitions Commission, Net Zero America, et cetera, et cetera. And you'll note that if you look at state laws that set a goal of zero carbon for the utilities, they define it as zero carbon, as clean electricity, not as 100% renewable in 99% of cases. Also, the Biden administration, when they set a goal for the power sector for 2035, it was 100% clean, not 100% renewable. So this is a misused metric to just focus on nothing but LCOE. WRI has a paper on this, and there's many other links you can dive into. If you're not convinced yet, then I just want to assign one piece of required reading. One piece. The Challenges of Achieving 100% Renewable Electricity System, published last year by 16 authors from our own National Renewable Energy Lab. And they said significant unanswered questions remain regarding moving toward or achieving 100% renewable at national scale for all hours of the year. There is no simple answer to how far we can increase RE penetration before costs rise dramatically or reliability becomes compromised. And why? As you pointed out earlier, wind and solar are intermittent sources, and the grid operator must integrate these sources in ways to keep the lights on 24/7. Integration costs include building a transmission system that aggregates intermittent sources over a bigger geographic area so the intermittency is reduced. It means storage, building batteries or other means of storage to catch the power when it's abundant and deploy it when the sun goes down and the wind doesn't blow. Demand management systems and practices that move power from when we don't have renewables to use it when we do have renewables. And finally, even deliberate overgeneration and spilling of power in some time periods so you have enough when you have periods of lower overall generation. All of these costs, none of this is free. All of these costs are not included in the LCOE calculation. All of them escalate as you get closer to 100%. So that's, if it's one big takeaway, if you're not familiar with power system dynamics and how it feeds into the whole question of pathways to net zero, this is my takeaway. So they conclude, same paper, same authors, reducing the cost of low carbon generation in the electric sector, potentially by keeping non-renewable options on the table, carbon capture and storage, nuclear. This will enable electrifying and thus decarbonizing other sectors, reducing economy-wide emissions. If you want more reinforcement on this, there's a piece in the latest IPCC report, box 6.8, 3 pages, read it. Same message. So what this indicates is roles for firm, dispatchable, clean power from advanced geothermal, from burning hydrogen in turbines, but also from existing nuclear power plants. If they're safe to operate, we can keep them running and crank out zero carbon power. We can develop advanced designs that are safer. We can do small modular reactors that hold promise to bring the cost down. We can also explore natural gas with carbon capture and storage. I particularly commend to you something called the alum cycle, mentioned in the IPCC report, being developed by a company called Net Power that has 100% capture of CO2 emissions, no water use, reduced conventional pollutant emissions. What's not to like about a power system like that? To be fair, there are dissenting views, as you know. There are people will disagree with me on this. Writers like Mark Jacobson at Stanford, Sven Teske, based in Australia, and a Finnish university that puts out 100% renewable scenarios, again, for electricity and powering the entire energy system. Take a look, compare it to the work of the IPCC and IEA and all the other sources I mentioned. What you'll find is that the 100% renewable pathways envision a massive expansion of transmission systems, huge amounts of battery storage and lots of thermal storage, unprecedented amounts of load shifting and demand management. They may be technically feasible, pushing the limits, but we also have to think about affordability and really maintaining that 24/7 reliability. Final note, what are governments doing? What are governments planning? What are they saying to the UNFCCC? WRI did a review of the long-term strategies submitted to the UNFCCC last year. And when we reviewed those first 29 long-term strategies, we found that 18 countries indicated they plan to use CCS, 16 countries plan to use nuclear generation. And if we zoom in on the big emitters, if we zoom in on the G7 countries, 5 of those countries include nuclear in their long-term strategy. If we look at the G20 countries, 9 that have submitted LTSs so far have nuclear in their long-term strategy. If we look at 5 additional G20 countries that haven't submitted yet, Argentina, Brazil, India, Russia, Turkey, they have nuclear plants planned or under construction. So, I mean, I'm sure some of you have feelings this way or that way about the future of nuclear generation. We can talk about that. But if you look at what governments are doing, they are planning on making this a piece of their long-term strategy and their path to decarbonization. Most of the credible modeling studies that I cited earlier envision a power system 60, 70, 80, maybe even 90% wind and solar in the future, but complemented by other zero carbon sources to maintain affordability and reliability. Let's turn to the other deep dive, which is that strategy number 4 on carbon capture. The IRA bumps up tax incentives for various forms. $60 a ton now for carbon capture and utilization, industrial processes, bumped it up to $85 a ton to capture carbon and store it underground, and up to $180 a ton for the direct capture of CO2 from the air and storage. Why is this so important? To do that, we need to look at the latest IPCC report that says, how the heck do we keep the planet safe at maybe 1.5 or 2 degrees? This is the iconic graph from the 6th assessment report that shows gigatons globally of CO2, again, not all greenhouse gases, the timeline out to 2100. Here we are in 2020 at about 40 gigatons globally. And the challenge for you and me, for our generation, is to get on a very steep path to get down to close to net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. And depending on exactly how fast we bend that curve, we might end up at 2 degrees, we might end up 1.5 degrees, but it is a daunting task. And carbon capture is an important part of it. The IPCC concludes that we're going to need carbon capture to reduce emissions in industry and potentially also in the power sector. But also we are going to ultimately need to remove a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We're going to need to offset the warming effects of CO2 that we simply can't squeeze out of other parts of the economy. Maybe we're still going to be burning fossil fuels in the aviation sector by 2050. Maybe not, but there's probably going to be some residual fossil fuel use in pockets of the economy. We're also going to have to offset the residual emissions of the non-CO2 gases. Right now, we don't know how to take them all the way to zero. We're still going to be having cows that belch. We're still going to have growing rice that's emitting methane. We're still going to be using trace industrial gases that have warming effects. We're going to have to offset that. And then finally, unfortunately, there is a good likelihood we may overshoot safe greenhouse gas levels and go above 2 degrees warming. We're going to have to, in that case, literally pull CO2 out of the air to take us back to concentration levels that keep the planet at a safe level of warming. So all of that points to the idea that we are going to have to literally have a global economy in the second half of the century that's probably emitting net negative emissions. How can we do that? What are our options? As you probably know, there are nature-based solutions involving forest and soil management. We know how to do this. They're ready now. There are large co-benefits often in terms of biodiversity. But one of the challenges is you're dealing with multiple landowners, some tiny landowners, some big landowners. Often the carbon dioxide that we can store in soil and forest is hard to measure. That doesn't mean you don't do it, but keep in mind it's hard to measure. And sadly, there's also a risk of loss, particularly in forests. As you have seen wildfires erupt all over the planet, we have to acknowledge that storing carbon in forests is not necessarily permanent. We should push on the nature-based solutions as much as possible, but again, we need to complement them with technological solutions. We have not fully commercialized, but on the drawing board, BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, dedicated growth of plants, combust the plants for power or heat, and capture the carbon. We also have at the pilot stage, direct air capture and storage, literally the processing through a facility of huge amounts of air and pulling out the CO2 through various chemical processes and storing it or using it. Right now, it's very expensive. We hope we can drive the cost down. There's other options underway involving seawater storage, mineralization enhancement, et cetera. But the key thing here is to note that we're going to have to be pulling out 5, 10, maybe 20 billion tons of CO2 out of the air in the second half of the century. This exceeds the capability of doing this with nature-based solutions alone. And so we need to get going on scaling up and commercializing these options. There are dissenting views on carbon capture too. What I just said is a mainstream view of the IPCC, our National Academy of Sciences, and on and on and on. But you will see headlines and articles that recently in the New York Times, every dollar spent on this climate technology is a waste. MIT Technology Review, carbon removal hype is becoming dangerous. Letters to governments, stop this madness. If you want, I think the most eloquent argument against this, I would commend you to a paper last year by the Center for International Environmental Law that says this doesn't work. This is too expensive. This is too risky. This prolongs dependence on fossil fuels. I respectfully disagree that it doesn't work. We know how to do this. Is it too expensive right now? Yeah, it's too expensive. Let's get going and scale up and drive the cost down and innovate. Is it too risky? I don't think so. We've been storing CO2 underground in the oil and gas industry for decades. But I think the toughest argument, the one that I encourage you to turn over in your mind, is kind of the moral hazard question. If we do this, does this somehow prolong dependence on fossil fuels? Does this slow the transition away from fossil fuels? In other words, invent this, deploy it, and then suddenly we say, why do we need to reduce fossil fuels? We'll just remove the CO2. Well, if we're that stupid, then I think it's game over in any case. Yes. Can I completely dismiss this moral hazard issue? No. But compare this to the physical hazard of not being able to take CO2 out of the atmosphere in sufficient quantity, of not having the options for industrial and power sector needs where we can't find another viable solution. I respectively align myself with the views of the IPCC and others. Which brings me to the final metaphor. We can place all of our chips on renewables alone, on just nature-based solutions, because everybody loves trees and farms and all that stuff. We can say that the risks of nuclear power are completely unacceptable. We should leave it in the ground and just phase out fossil fuels just as humanly fast as possible, and not develop technological CO2 removal. I think that's a risky bet. I think we should be spreading our chips on multiple technologies. Some are going to succeed, some are going to fail, some are going to reach limits, some won't. Also, as we think about this, you think of the US in particular, we're a richly endowed country. We got solar potential, we got wind potential we're taking advantage of. We can do offshore wind because we have coastlines. We have vast amounts of land that we can feed ourselves on. Consider other country conditions that don't have that rich endowment of renewable resources or potential. Some countries don't even have coastlines. So think about that. Let me touch finally on implementation issues. As I implied, we have plenty of experience with regulations and tax incentives. There's a vast literature on how to design carbon taxes. But instead, we have this vast economy-wide program of carrots. I think this is kind of unprecedented. I mean, sure, we've had tax incentives for X and Y and Z over the years, but to pull this together into a massive program to bend the curve, we are basically changing effective prices of multitude of products. We need to motivate large and small businesses, nonprofits, and millions of consumers to invest in certain things, purchase certain products over the next 10 years. This is an all hands on deck job and roles in business, federal government, state government, local government, and the nonprofit sector. I think we're going to hit big implementation issues in the siting and permitting of vast amounts of solar, wind, a new nuclear plant, a carbon capture facility. And even just the transmission expansion that does need to take place, even if we go to 60, 70, 80% renewable. I particularly like this paper that lays out the challenges of transmission. And as you probably know, right now in Congress, there is a big debate going on whether to do a enhanced siting and permitting and streamlining of that process. Other pieces of the puzzle, smaller but of interest to me particularly, electricity market design. If you're interested in that, Brian RFF did some workshops not too long ago. The market design affects about 2/3 of our generation, where we have restructured or partially deregulated the electricity industry, and whether those market designs are compatible with a rapid growth of zero carbon electricity, to me, is a very troubling question. Another thing I'll just throw out there, as we decarbonize, we need to switch from burning gas in our homes and buildings to using electricity, electric water heaters, electric stoves, electric space heating. Sometimes we have a combined electric and gas utility in which those switches in market share will operate under one corporate umbrella. It won't be like a fight to the death among, a gas and electric utility. Where they're separate, there's going to be a lot of conflict. What's better? Should we actually encourage more formation of combined electric and gas utilities to remove a disincentive for this cage match between electricity and gas? I pose the question. I don't have a good answer yet. Anyway, looks like we have a good chunk of time for Q&A. So I want to again thank you for the opportunity. If you need to peel off a one. Looks like let's start with some questions in the back.
Thank you. Hélène Benveniste, I'm a postdoc here. I had a question about what's in the IRA about the use or storage of carbon, what results from carbon capture. I was very surprised by the graph where you showed that there was a kind of a larger chunk for use than for storage. It seems to me that the only explanation would be that the use would be through enhanced oil recovery, which would not do much at all to contribute to emission reductions. So I'd just be interested in hearing more about what's in the IRA specifically for the use and for the sequestration infrastructure, which is non-existent, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think you're pointing to this particular illustration I used from the Jim Williams study. I have also been puzzled by this too. This is a modeling exercise, I think, from 2020, and how that use is allocated across maybe enhanced DOR, maybe industrial uses. I'm not sure, but it puzzled me too. So I can't defend that particular one. In terms of what the IRA expects in the usage of their enhanced tax credits, I don't have those numbers at my fingertips either. However, I think most of the expectation is in industrial sources, which tend to be the most cost effective at this point. They might be able to start to spur some gas with CCS, but we're again not sure of the economics. And then finally, on direct air capture, the $180 a ton tax credit, I think, will give a boost to that industry, but costs are still typically higher than that. But hopefully, it will spur more pilots, more learning, and more scaling. And why don't you pass the mic to the gentleman next to you, if it's still there?
Hi, I'm Andrew. Thank you so much for your talk. I was curious as to if you see gas, CCS, and nuclear as long-term complements to renewables or bridge fuels until there's better storage or other solutions for intermittency.
I will simply say, let's spread our chips. If you invented a long-term storage option tomorrow that could literally cover days and days of very low power output, we might not need nuclear or gas with CCS. Maybe we could run the whole thing with renewables. My favorite German word is Dunkelflaute, which means dark doldrums in German. Dunkelflautes happen often in the winter when solar production is the lowest, then you have cloud cover, and then the winds die. And this is an actual Dunkelflaute from Germany in 2017. It happens on a regular basis where you have days of very low solar and wind output. This is where you need either long-term storage or you need some option that is going to fill that gap. So I I don't try to forecast whether natural gas unabated or natural gas CCS is a bridge or not, but just we need to develop options and we need to start it now. We can't wait till 2030 or 2040 and say, maybe we need something besides renewables. You know, it's at least a decade-long trajectory to scale something up. Can you hand the mic to the gentleman behind? Oh, he's got it. Okay.
Thanks. Really enjoyed your talk. I'm Andrew Waxman. I'm at the Belfer Center. I was wondering your perspective on legacy utility costs. That was kind of your last bullet about gas and electric. And as we electrify the grid, you still have these large capital costs that need to be paid for at utility scale. And a lot of the people who are still living in older buildings with gas infrastructure are going to be predominantly lower income folks. And there's an analogy a little bit to transportation as well, because the last to adopt EVs are going to be ICE households, which are going to be people who can't necessarily afford to get a new car right now. And so just your perspective on dealing with some of these legacy costs, particularly because they might exacerbate concerns about regressivity in terms of climate policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. And to be honest, I haven't thought a lot about it. So I'll simply say a lot of those legacy costs are going to be dealt with by our PUCs, regulating the rates of electric and gas utilities, and it'll be a real challenge. However, one of the interesting things about the IRA is that rather than setting regulations or caps that typically drive up the cost for industry or utilities, by these subsidies, they are taking general tax revenues and lowering the cost of the cleaner technology. So in a sense, that cushions the blow to the lower income people because we are sort of all paying for it with general tax revenues. Let's see, did the mic come up? Wherever the mic is, go ahead. Or is it? Okay, we'll move our way forward here.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was just wondering, across the 4 net zero areas that you talked about, obviously in a lot of them we do have existing technologies that we just need to scale up, and the IRA is going to play a role in doing that. Where do you see the biggest opportunities or gaps for new technologies that actually don't necessarily exist today?
I think there's gaps in industry, there's gaps in, say, aviation fuel. Although we may do short haul flights with electric airplanes pretty soon, believe it or not. I think we're seeing gaps in, as I said to the other gentleman, it would be great to have inexpensive storage for electricity that lasts more than 4 or 8 hours. The current lithium batteries help us a lot on that kind of daily fluctuation, daily balancing issue, but they can't address the Dunkelflaute. And then in carbon capture, I'd love to wave a wand and find a cheap way to pull carbon dioxide out of the air. Right now, we have a couple demonstrated means. The costs are too high. I would love to see a breakthrough there, which would make us all sleep better at night. Let's pass the mic forward. Next.
Yeah, thank you. My question is still on the substitutability of this CCS versus the renewable energy. So we are still waiting some of the technologies to get mature and lowering down their costs in the future. But like, if we now allow many of the computation between different technological pathways, will it like kinds of make this process longer, that we should invest more in more specific technologies than this technological neutral perspective in the current act? Thank you.
Let me understand your question. Are you saying should we narrow our technology investments sort of on what we think are going to be winners and not cast the net as broad as I'm suggesting?
Yeah. So for me, I think it's not like in the long term, it's this dependency on fossil fuels due to this CCS, but it might be that because we invest more in the CCS technology, we're not allocating enough budget on the maturity of other technologies that's making this process longer than it should be.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that it's a legitimate question. You know, one could take one could take an irrational approach at the casino table and bet on everything. It needs to hold some promise in order to put some chips on that number. And I tried to make the argument that we can't do this with renewables alone. We're going to have to invest to try to commercialize one or more, actually, try to commercialize several complements to a heavy solar and wind system. If we can get there 60, 70, 80+% with intermittent solar and wind, great. But what do we need to complement it? Long-term storage could be one complement. Nuclear power could be another complement. Advanced geothermal, very deep drilling could complement it, or natural gas with CCS, biomass with CCS. As long as it's zero carbon, it could be, and it's dispatchable in some form, then we probably have a good complement.
You mentioned not to forget the non-CO2 gases. So I want to ask about the methane fee. Do you think it's enough of a stick to drive changes in industry?
Not an expert in methane. I will trust the drafters of the law to have done their homework and to have concluded that this will be a significant lever on the oil and gas industry to tighten up those leaks. But I haven't looked deeply into that question.
Thanks. Thank you. I'm curious about the $180 per ton CDR tax credit. So it seems like that's oddly specific, like it's only for direct air capture. I think on the storage side, it has to be injected into like the salt rock as well to qualify for that credit. So do you know why there was such a non-technology neutral approach for that compared to, you know, on the renewables side?
That's a good question. I don't have a good answer for that. Perhaps it's the only it's the one that is very measurable, as opposed to enhanced weathering of rocks is going to be much more difficult to measure. They definitely, of course, want it to be stored, and the 180 also reflects the anticipated storage cost. Some of the other direct air cap, the other CDR methods, again, are at such an early stage, maybe that perhaps they felt they could not write a broader definition at this point. But again, I don't know, I can't say that I know the thinking of the drafters in depth there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for great presentation. I'm just wondering, you point about the tax credit. I know in Europe, in some countries, they also implement like feed-in tariff policy to stimulate clean energy development. So how is difference between this tax credit and the feed-in tariff policy, and what is more effective? I mean, for environmental integrity more effective, and how they impact on this clean energy cost? Because you talk about how they drive the cost, they reduce, and how they transfer to reduce. I saw you point the great point in your topic, the inflation reduction. Yeah, so I'm wondering how this cost and the value and the inflation change for this tax credit. Thank you.
On the inflation question, I think economists have looked hard at this. I think there may be some small positive impact on reducing inflation, but I don't think anyone thinks it will be a huge impact. On your question on feed-in tariffs, I believe it'd be fair to say that feed-in tariffs are have been really focused on rooftop solar, where the consumer gets gets a direct benefit in decreasing their bill, whereas the kind of tax incentives envisioned here would again be across the board for all zero carbon technology and could be built at a small scale, medium scale, or huge wind farm scale or solar farm scale. So the feed-in tariff has been quite successful in stimulating the industry, as you said, in Europe, but it has a much narrower application, is my understanding. But I'm not an expert in feed-in tariffs, and anyone should correct me if that doesn't sound right.
Thank you very much. My question is related to the direct air capture. You mentioned there's an incentive of $180 per this thing. My question is, would this incentive be available if a US company sets up a DAC in a country outside of US? Maybe because they find cheaper sequestration methods there or a site which is more suitable. So any thoughts on that?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to it if it can go outside U.S. borders. Your question, I think, points to, of course, something ubiquitous in climate change is that at one level we shouldn't care where the CO2 comes out because it is a giant mixing bowl. So in theory, it would be nice to be able to reward that activity anywhere. Yeah, Jim.
Yeah, hi. A comment and a question. So the comment is, the narrative you presented for the evolution of policy over the last several decades in this area stresses the going from the from the sticks to the carrots. Just the two comments on that, and you alluded to at least one of these. One of these is that there are plenty of carrots earlier on. So the wind and solar ITC, PTC extension, essentially what the IRA does extends those, modifies them, and some good modifications, but essentially the same numerical values, just extending them. Same thing with the EV tax credit, same thing with CCS. So there's, been those, the most important ones, which is the EV and ITC, PTC, have been around for quite a while. And on top of that, the second point is that you could imagine passing something like this. Suppose this were passed in 2007. It sure as heck wouldn't have the projected emissions impact that it does today, because all of those alternative technologies were so expensive that at best you're going to get these really small things. And we've seen it roll in very slowly. So I think it's more that, there wasn't really any choice but to have more of the sticks if you're going to take serious action in 2000 than the carrots. The second, this is a question, the modeling that you alluded to, by and large suggests that we're going to get somewhere between 300 and 600 million metric tons out of the power sector by 2030 as a result of this. So you don't have that chart up there, but that's
power sector alone.
Exactly. The power sector alone, which is the big chunk here, is about 300 to 600 million metric tons across the different models. The one exception is energy innovation, and they have no transmission capacity building constraints, which might not be the most desirable assumption. So that leaves us, right now we're at 1,500 or 1,600 million metric tons. That still leaves us very far shy of even an 80% decarbonization goal by 2030 for the power sector. So what's next?
What's next? I wonder if I should have Sarah do that at one of the coming lectures. What's next after this? What could we do to accelerate decarbonization of the power sector beyond what this might achieve? Potentially there could be a revival of something like the Clean Power Plan that Obama had proposed that would put the industry on even a faster track. One can imagine state goals or even utility goals strengthening. I think one of the really encouraging signs is that a number of industries have really said, we're all in on this. And I think the electric utility sector has been very progressive on saying we are setting ambitious targets. Companies like Excel saying, we're going to get to 80%. And other utilities setting net zero targets for 2050. So really strengthening those and ensuring that those utilities do meet, in this case, perhaps voluntary targets would help us. So those are some of the things that might help.
So let me close with our last question. We've got 1 minute left. So I'll be brief, and then I have a closing announcement after your response, Karl, which I think this builds on some of what Jim asked. We have these estimates, which are ex ante. We have a spending of 369 billion, which is also ex ante. Most of that are tax scores. So we're just going to learn in practice which one of these are taken up consistent with expectations, some greater than expectations, some less so. What are you going to be looking for over, say, the next 5 years to see if the IRA is delivering on what we expected? Or what might be sort of the early signals of some things are working out better than expected or some things are working out less than expected? What are there a couple either industries or investment patterns that you would be looking for to get a sense of how well or poorly this bill is working?
Yeah, I think job one is to look across the agencies with the rule writing responsibilities, like Treasury especially, but also DOE and to some extent EPA, and say, do they have the rules in place fast enough to let people get moving on things? Second thing, I think already encouraging, and I wish I had noted a couple anecdotes here, but even just after the passage of the IRA and also feeding off of the earlier infrastructure bill and the CHIPS and Science Act, we've had some companies announce that they are going to build this kind of factory, ship this kind of production to the US. That's encouraging. So tracking, I would want to track, key elements of this in terms of, solar panel production, wind, batteries, and the EV production. Tracking whether, again, key industry, whether the auto industry sticks to their current pledges to go all EV by a certain time, would be another thing to track. So those are some of the things. But as we talked about even in your office before, this is going to be a real challenge to enable this to move forward, to have the right people in place in government to help move these things forward. And as I encourage you all in this room, as you think about what's next after your MPP or your PhD, finding a niche to help this work would be a huge contribution. So thanks again.
And before we wrap up, reminder, we'll meet 12 in this room Monday, October 2nd. Mike Davidson of UC San Diego will join us for his talk, Decoupling from China in Clean Tech, Risk and Rewards. And finally, please join me in thanking Karl Hausker for his presentation today. Okay.